The prairie was quiet that evening, the kind of quiet that pressed against the heart and made every thought feel louder than it should. The sun had slipped low behind the rolling hills, staining the sky in strokes of crimson and gold. Little church stood at the edge of the settlement, its whitewashed boards worn by wind and dust, its bell silent since the funeral weeks before. She walked slowly across the yard, her black dress brushing against the wild grass, her veil gone. But her mourning not yet lifted. The preacher's widow was known for her grace, for her steadfast devotion, for the way she carried sorrow without letting it weigh down the rest of the town. Yet behind her calm eyes there stirred something she had locked away, something she dared not confess even to herself. Her husband had been the town's shepherd, stern in his sermons, yet gentle in his kindness, a man who filled every pew and steadied every wavering soul. His absence left a hollow place, not only in the church, but in her heart. Nights felt longer now, and silence inside her home felt sharper, as if the walls themselves leaned close to listen to her restless sighs. Still, she kept her chin high when neighbors called. She poured tea, she offered scripture, she whispered comfort. None could see that beneath her black shawl and steady voice. There lived a secret longing of fire she had never dared let breathe. In the open air, it was on the road leading from the west that he first appeared, a stranger with dust on his boots and a shadow in his gaze. The townsfolk whispered that he was a drifter, the kind who never stayed in one place, the kind who carried his past like a saddle too heavy to lay down. He rode no horse, carried no Bible, spoke with no certainty. He simply walked into town with the dusk at his back, his jaw unshaven, his hat brim low. Some said they saw trouble in him. Others said they saw freedom. The widow saw both. The first time their eyes met was outside the churchyard. She had been tending the little patch of flowers her husband once planted, pulling weeds with dirt on her gloves. He paused at the gate, his hand resting on the weathered wood, and for a moment the world seemed to still around them. She straightened, brushing soil from her dress, her heart startling at the unfamiliar stir it gave. He tipped his hat, not in mockery, but with a kind of respect that was rare in such men. His voice was low when he asked for water, his accent touched with roads she had never traveled. She led him to the well, her hands steady, though her breath betrayed her. From that moment, an unspoken current stretched between them, something neither of them named. The drifter did not kneel in the church pews, did not bow his head when the townsfolk prayed, yet he lingered. He found small work where he could, fixing a fence, carrying lumber, mending a roof. Cautioned the women with curiosity. The widow, however, felt the pull of him like the tide feels the moon. It was not his words, for he spoke little. It was not his looks, though the cut of his figure stirred whispers among the young. It was something deeper, something restless. Inside him, that mirrored the restlessness inside her. She fought against it. Each night she reminded herself of her vows, even though death had released her from them. She told herself she was still the preacher's wife in the eyes of the town, bound to his memory, bound to his faith. Desire, she thought, was temptation. Yet temptation was not always the devil's work. Sometimes it was the ache of being alive, the reminder that the heart beats not only for duty, but for longing. She tried to bury it beneath chores, beneath prayer, beneath the careful mask she wore for her neighbors. Still, when she caught sight of the drifter leaning against a post at the general store, or walking with that slow, steady stride across the dusty road, something inside her quickened. One evening, a storm rolled in sudden and wild, sweeping across the plains with a fury that rattled windows and shook the earth. The townsfolk hurried indoors, shutters slammed, lanterns dimmed. The widow, caught outside gathering linens from the line, struggled against the wind. Rain lashed her face, her dress clung heavy to her skin, and as she fought to secure the last of the cloth, a hand closed over hers. She looked up through the downpour, and there he was drenched, hair plastered to his forehead, eyes burning in the storm's half-light. Without a word, he pulled the linens free and carried them with her inside. Inside the small house, thunder growled as they dropped the sodden bundle. Her breath came sharp, her heart unsteady, the storm outside no louder than the storm within. She tried to speak, to thank him, to send him on his way, but the words tangled on her tongue. He stood close, too close, the heat of his presence stirring the air. His gaze lingered on her, not in disrespect, not in pity, but in raw honesty, as if he saw through every layer she had built. Every veil of propriety, every prayer meant to cover what pulsed beneath. For the first time since her husband's death, she felt alive, not as a widow, not as a sainted memory, but as a woman with blood in her veins and a yearning that would not be silenced. She stepped back, trembling, torn between fear and surrender. Yet he followed, not with force, but with certainty, as though drawn by something greater than choice. His hand rose, hesitated, then brushed against her cheek. Her breath caught, her knees weak. And then, in the charged silence, he did what she had both dreaded and secretly wished. He bent close, and his lips pressed to hers. The kiss was not gentle, nor cruel. It was fire meeting fire, the storm outside finding its echo within. Every hidden desire she had locked away burst free in that instant, and her soul burned with the truth she had long denied. She should have pulled away, should have rebuked him, should have remembered the preacher's voice that once filled this very room. But she did not. She let the moment consume her, a confession without words, surrender without promise. And yet, just as suddenly as it began, kiss left her with a silence more deafening than thunder. Stepped back, his eyes searching hers, as if waiting for judgment, as if waiting for her to cast him out or call him back. She stood there, trembling, lips parted, heart torn between heaven and earth. Outside, the storm raged on, but the greater storm was in her chest. Would she cling to the memory of the man she had lost? Or would she dare to follow the dangerous flame that now threatened to change everything she had ever known? The answer hung in the air, unspoken, as the night pressed close around them. In that unresolved moment, their story truly began. The silence between them lingered, heavy as the storm outside. The widow could still feel the warmth of his lips on hers, as though the kiss had branded her, as though it had awakened something that could never again be buried. She wanted to speak, to demand why he had dared such a thing, to tell him to leave, yet the words clung to her throat. Instead, she stood frozen, trembling, unsure if she feared him or herself more in that moment. The drifter's eyes held her, dark and searching, but he said nothing. Then, with the sound of rain hammering against the roof, he turned and walked toward the door. His hand rested on the latch, waiting, as if he would leave if she told him. Too, as if the choice belonged entirely to her. But she said nothing. She only listened as thunder cracked across the plains, her silence binding him to her as surely as words could have. When he finally stepped outside, the storm swallowed him, whole, leaving her alone in the dimly lit room, with her heart pounding like a church bell, struck in warning. She pressed her hands to her face, shaking, ashamed of her own weakness, yet unable to deny the spark that now burned hotter than her fear. She thought of her late husband, his steady voice, his calm hand resting on the Bible as he preached about righteousness and sin. He had always told her that the heart was a treacherous thing, that it could be led astray if not anchored in faith. And yet, here she was, standing on the edge of something that felt more alive than all the years she had sat dutifully in the front pew. Nodding along to his sermons, sleep eluded her that night. The storm passed, but inside her chest the unrest only grew. She lay awake, staring at the rafters, listening to the hollow creaks of the house. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the drifter's face wet with rain. Shadowed by longing, bold enough to cross a line no man had dared since her husband's passing. She tried to convince herself it was only loneliness that made her vulnerable, only the ache of empty nights and silence at her table. But in her heart, she knew it was more than that. Something about him unsettled her in ways she could not explain, as though he carried with him a story not yet told, a past that might destroy them both if she dared to step closer. The next morning, the town stirred as though nothing had changed. The blacksmith hammered at his anvil. The shopkeeper swept dust from his doorway. Children chased one another through the narrow street. Yet for the widow, the world had shifted. She dressed carefully, pulling her shawl tighter, hoping no one could see the turmoil inside her. At the well, the women spoke in hushed tones about the drifter. Some said he had been seen near the old mill. Others claimed he had spent the storm inside the barn of a farmer too generous for his own good. The widow kept her head low, saying little, though every word about him pierced her ears. Later, she saw him again. He was standing at the edge of the street, hammering nails into a fence post, his shirt rolled to his elbows, the sweat of his labor darkening the fabric. He did not glance her way, though she felt his awareness as surely as if he had touched her again. She walked past, forcing her gaze forward, yet the memory of the kiss burned hotter than the summer sun. As days passed, the drifter became a fixture in the town, though never fully accepted. He worked odd jobs, earned small coins, and kept two. Himself, the men distrusted him, muttering that he had no business lingering so long in one place. The women, though curious, kept their distance, wary of the way he carried himself with a kind of defiant solitude. Only the widow felt the full weight of his presence. She avoided him in public, yet in private her thoughts wandered where they should not. Every time she heard a knock at her door, her heart leaped, half dreading, half hoping it might be him. What troubled her most was not only her longing, but the question she dared not ask. Who was he really? Where had he come from? What had driven him onto the lonely road that led him here? Sometimes she thought she saw shadows in his eyes, a heaviness he carried like an invisible wound. And yet beneath it, there was a gentleness too, glimpsed in small moments when he lifted a child's dropped toy from the dust, or when he helped an old man carry a sack of grain without being asked. He was a contradiction, a man who seemed both dangerous and deeply human. And it was this mystery that drew her closer against her better judgment. One evening, as the sun dipped low, she found herself walking the long path behind the church. It was quiet there, the graves marked by weathered stones, the air heavy with memory. She paused at her husband's grave, tracing the carved letters with trembling fingers. She whispered a prayer for strength, for guidance, for release from the storm inside her heart. But even as she prayed, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned, and there he was, the drifter, standing at the edge of the path with his hat in his hands. For a moment, neither spoke. The air between them carried more weight than words could. Finally, he said softly, "I didn't mean to cause you trouble?" His voice was rough, but sincere. She shook her head, unable to answer. Trouble, yes, but also something else, something she was not ready to name. He stepped closer, his boots crunching on the gravel, his eyes steady on hers. "I don't stay in places long," he continued. "I've learned it's better that way. But this time, I can't seem to walk on." Her breath caught. She wanted to ask why, but fear held her tongue. She could not bear to know, and yet she could not bear not to. He looked down at her husband's grave, his jaw tightening as though he understood more than he should. Then he looked back at her, his gaze full of something raw and unguarded. "You think you're bound," he said quietly, "but you're not. You're alive. Don't forget that." His words struck her deeper than any sermon ever had. Alive. She wanted to deny it, to insist she belonged only to memory, only to faith. Yet the truth pulsed within her like a secret flame, refusing to be smothered. She turned away her eyes. Stinging with tears, she told him to leave her, to let her be. He hesitated, then tipped his hat and walked off, his figure retreating into the long shadows of dusk. That night, she lay awake once more, torn between guilt and hunger, between fear and desire. She thought of her neighbors, of what they would say if they knew. She thought of her husband, of his voice echoing in her memory. She thought of the drifter, of the way he looked at her as though he saw not just the widow, but the woman beneath. And though she prayed for the feelings to leave her, they did not. They grew stronger with each passing day, binding her to him even as she tried to push him away. The town itself seemed to sense the tension. Whispers grew louder. Some wondered why the drifter lingered, why he had not moved on. Few men spoke openly of running him out before trouble came, yet the trouble was already here, not in the streets, but in her heart. She feared what might happen if the drifter stayed. She feared even more what might happen if he left. The days stretched into nights, the nights into restless dawns, and the story between them remained unwritten, suspended in silence and longing. But beneath it all, the widow knew that something was coming, something that would shatter the fragile balance she clung to. The drifter was not a man who belonged to any place, yet somehow he had become part of her world. And though she fought against it, though she told herself it could never be, she could not shake the feeling that their paths had crossed for a reason. And that reason was only beginning to reveal itself. The fire that had sparked with a single kiss had not faded. It smoldered still, waiting, threatening, daring to rise again. And deep down, she knew it was only a matter of time before it did. The town grew restless as summer stretched on. Dust settled thick in the streets, and tempers ran just as hot as the air. Drifter had become a shadow that people couldn't ignore, his presence stirring unease in ways no sermon could calm. Men muttered at the saloon that strangers who stayed too long carried trouble in their pockets. Women whispered at the well that the preacher's widow was not the same since he had arrived. Some swore they had seen her watching him when she thought no one noticed. Others claimed the drifter's eyes lingered too long when she passed by. Gossip in a small town was like wildfire. Once it sparked, it fed on itself, devouring everything in its path. The widow felt the burn of those whispers each time she walked through town. Neighbors smiled politely, but their eyes slid sideways, heavy with questions. She tried to keep her head high, to remind herself she had done nothing wrong, but her own heart betrayed her. She could not deny the pull that tied her to the drifter, though she prayed each night for strength to resist it. Every knock at her door sent her pulse racing. Every glimpse of him across the dusty street set her mind spinning with thoughts she dared not voice. The drifter, for his part, never explained himself. He worked quietly, earned his keep, and spent his evenings sitting outside the boarding house, with a cigarette glowing in the dark. He spoke little to the townsfolk, but when he did, his words carried weight. Some found him respectful, others called him prideful. A man who held his past close could never be fully trusted. And yet, beneath the suspicion, there was something about him that unsettled even those who wished to drive him out in honesty, that felt more dangerous than lies. One afternoon, blacksmith confronted him in the street. Drifter had just finished hauling sacks of grain when the blacksmith blocked his path. Arms crossed, eyes hard. "We don't need rootless men here," the blacksmith said, his voice loud enough for half the town to hear. "Folks who drift bring storms behind them. Move on before trouble finds you." The drifter didn't raise his voice, didn't flinch. He only looked the man in the eye and said, "Sometimes storms come, whether you want them or not." Then he walked past, leaving the blacksmith sputtering. His pride stung by the calm reply. The widow heard of it that evening, and her stomach knotted. She feared what open conflict might mean, not only for him but for herself. The more the town turned against him, the more her own secret burned. Each day she found herself torn between duty to the life she had known and the unshakable truth of her desire. She wanted to push him away, to guard her heart, but each time she tried, something pulled her back. Her own household began to betray her. The walls seemed to remember his presence. The way rainwater had dripped from his coat onto her floor, the way his shadow had stretched across her parlor during the storm. At night, she lit a single candle and sat in silence, the flickering flame reminding her of the fire inside her chest. She prayed, but her prayers came fractured, confused. Like half-written letters never sent, there was another layer to her struggle, one she dared not speak aloud. She had discovered papers tucked away in her late husband's desk notes, from sermons never preached, private doubts scrawled in a hand she had once trusted beyond question. In those pages, she found not certainty, but conflict. A man wrestling with his own demons of doubt and desire. It unsettled her, shaking the pedestal she had placed him on. If even he had wrestled with secret hunger, could her own longings be So unforgivable? The revelation deepened her torment, making the drifter's presence feel less like temptation and more like truth she had long denied. Meanwhile, the town's unease began to boil. A theft was reported at the general store, nothing more than a missing knife. But it was enough to fuel suspicion. Though there was no proof, eyes turned quickly toward the stranger. Rumors spread that he had come here running from law, that he carried sin in his wake. The sheriff, a weary man who had no taste for conflict, spoke quietly with the drifter one evening outside the saloon. No one heard their words, but by morning, the sheriff's gaze on the widow carried an edge of pity, as if he feared she was caught in something that would end badly. The drifter himself seemed to feel the tightening noose of the town's mistrust, but he did not leave. If anything, his eyes grew sharper, more watchful, as though he knew danger was circling but refused to step aside. One night, under the pale wash of moonlight, he found her walking near the churchyard. She froze when she saw him, but he didn't move closer, only stood in the shadows. "You're not safe being seen with me," he said quietly. His voice carried more sorrow than warning. "They'll turn on you before they turn on me." Her chest ached at his words, for she knew they were true. And yet, in that moment, she felt something stronger than fear-defiance. She met his gaze and whispered, "Then why don't you go?" For a long time he said nothing. Finally he answered, "Because I can't." Those words, spoken so simply, shattered her resolve more than any kiss could. She turned away before tears betrayed her, her footsteps quick on the gravel path. But his voice followed her, low and certain. "This won't end clean." The widow knew he was right. The conflict now stretched beyond her own heart. But it lived. In the eyes of her neighbors, in the whispers carried through town, in the suspicion gathering like thunderclouds. And beneath it all, something deeper brewed. Something about the drifter's past that remained hidden but pressed closer with every passing day. One evening, as she sat alone with her candlelight, she heard a sound outside her window boots. On the porch, her heart leaped, but when she opened the door, it wasn't the drifter who stood there. It was the sheriff, his hat in his hands, his face lined with unease. "I thought you ought to know," he said, glancing over his shoulder as if the night itself might be listening. "That man you've taken pity on, he's not here by chance. Word is, someone's been asking after him, someone dangerous." The widow's blood ran cold. She wanted to demand answers, to insist the sheriff tell her everything he knew. But he only shook his head and muttered, "Keep your distance, for your own sake." Then he left her with more questions than answers, the echo of his boots fading into the night. She closed the door and pressed her back against it, trembling. If the drifter carried a past that could find him here, then her heart was not only in danger of scandal, it was in danger of ruin. And yet, as fear gripped her, another thought took hold. One she dared not speak. If his past had followed him, and perhaps she was not the only one standing at the edge of a storm that could not be stopped. The conflict was no longer only inside. It was in the town, in the whispers, in the shadows creeping closer each day. The widow felt it pressing down on her, the sense that everything she had known was unraveling. Yet even as fear consumed her, her soul burned still for the man who had forced her to remember she was alive. And the worst part was knowing she could not turn away, not now, not ever. The air in town thickened as if the whole place was holding its breath. Days dragged under a strange tension, the kind that made neighbors speak in whispers and men keep their rifles closer than usual. The drifter went about his work as if he did not notice, but the widow saw it in the set of his shoulders, in the way his eyes swept the street more often, sharp and alert. She sensed it too, that something was drawing nearer, something he had been carrying all along that now pressed hard at the edges of their small world. Her own nights had become unbearable. The whispers of the townsfolk had grown into open talk, and she could feel the judgment in every glance. Women who once sought her comfort now avoided her eyes. Men looked at her with suspicion, as though she were guilty of whatever sins they had pinned to the drifter's back. Even the church pews seemed colder, emptier, their silence louder than any hymn. She tried to pray, but her words faltered before They reached her lips. Desire and fear wrestled inside her, each as fierce as the other, till she hardly recognized herself anymore. The sheriff's warning lingered in her ears. Someone was searching for the drifter, someone dangerous. That knowledge gnawed at her, filling her dreams with shadowed figures and footsteps on her porch. But it wasn't only fear that consumed Hurt, it was the thought of losing him. The man who had lit a fire she hadn't known she still carried. If his past caught him, would he be forced to flee?
No.
Would he leave her with nothing but the echo of his kiss, the memory of a truth she could never speak aloud? One evening, as dusk bled into night, she found herself drawn to the churchyard again. The graves lay quiet, their stones bathed in pale silver light. She knelt at her husband's resting place, her heart heavy, torn between loyalty to the man she had lost and the undeniable pull of the man who remained.
Ace.
Her whispered prayer broke halfway, her voice cracking. She felt the weight of heaven above her, but also the raw earth beneath her knees, reminding her that she was still flesh and blood, still alive. Footsteps broke the silence, steady and slow. She didn't need to look to know who it was. The drifter stood behind her, his shadow stretching long across the stones. He said nothing at first, only waited, his presence filling the air like thunder before a storm. At last he spoke, his voice low, rough with something she couldn't name. "They'll come soon." Her breath caught. She turned to face him, fear and longing colliding in her chest. "Who?" she whispered. His jaw tightened, his gaze fixed. "On the horizon beyond the graves, men I left behind. Men who don't forgive." His words were simple, but the weight of them pressed heavy between them. She searched his face, trying to read the truth behind his silence. And in that moment, she saw it clearly, the hunted look he carried, the burden of roads behind him. The danger that clung to him like dust he could never wash away. He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the heat of him in the cool night air. His eyes held hers, fierce and unyielding. "If they come, they'll tear through this town to find me, and they'll use whatever they can to break me. Even you." The words cut sharp, but beneath them she heard something else fear not for himself, but for her. Her hands trembled at her sides, torn between the urge to reach for him, the urge to push him away. The storm that had begun with a kiss now swelled to its breaking point. Every moment they had shared, every glance, every silence had led to this truth. He could not stay, yet he could not leave. And she could not let him go, though to keep him meant ruin. That night the town did not sleep easily. Lanterns flickered late in windows, dogs barked at shadows, and the widow lay awake, her heart pounding with dread. She could not banish his words from her mind. "They'll come soon." Each creak of her house sounded like boots on the porch. Each gust of wind rattling the shutters felt like a warning. Yet beneath the fear, the fire inside her burned hotter still, defying reason, defying faith. The next day brought no relief. The sun rose heavy and hot, pressing down on the streets. Men gathered in uneasy clusters, speaking low but glancing often at the drifter. The blacksmith sharpened his axe with unnecessary force, the scrape of metal echoing like a threat. Even the sheriff looked unsettled, his eyes darting from the drifter to the horizon, as if expecting riders to appear at any moment. The town itself seemed to be bracing for something unseen, a storm not of weather, but of fate. The widow felt trapped between two worlds. In her home, she held her late husband's Bible in her hands, but the words blurred before her eyes. At the window, she watched the drifter move through the streets with that steady stride, each step carrying him closer to danger. She wanted to run to him, to beg him to leave, before it was too late. Yet she also wanted to hold him there, to keep him near, no matter the cost. Every choice led to loss, and she feared whichever path she took would break her soul. As night fell, the tension reached its peak. The drifter stood alone at the edge of town, his figure dark against the fading light. The widow saw him from her doorway, her breath catching as the wind carried the faint sound of horses in the distance. The horizon seemed to shift, shapes moving against the dying glow of the sun. She knew, without being told, that the men he had spoken of were near. The town stirred, doors shutting, lamps being blown out, as if the people sensed what was coming. The widow's hands gripped the frame of her doorway, her knuckles white. Her heart pounded with the certainty that everything was about to change, that the fragile balance she had clung to was shattering at last. The drifter did not move, did not turn, only stood facing the horizon as though waiting for judgment itself. She stepped onto the porch, torn between calling out to him and remaining silent. Her voice failed her, choked by fear and longing. And then, in the dimming light, she saw the riders crest the rise, their silhouettes sharp against the dying sky. The sound of hooves thundered across the plains, growing louder, closer, inevitable. The widow's breath hitched, her body frozen, her soul caught between dread and desire. The drifter's past had arrived. With it came the storm that would decide everything. The climax hovered on the horizon, pressing down on the town, pressing into her heart. And she knew, as the riders drew near, that nothing, not prayer, not silence, not the chains of memory, could hold back what was about to come. The sound of hooves rolled over the plains like thunder, carrying with it the weight of everything that had been left unsaid. The widow gripped the post of her porch, her body trembling as the riders came into view. She saw them clearly, no 3 men, rough and hard, their faces shadowed by the setting sun, their posture telling the story before their words ever could. These were not travelers, these were hunters. The drifter stood tall at the edge of town, waiting, his shoulders squared as though he had expected this moment all along. He did not move, did not reach for a weapon, only faced them with a calm that chilled her more than any storm. The town held its breath. Doors stayed shut, lamps dimmed, and yet every window was surely lined with watchful eyes. No one wanted to be seen, but no one could turn away. The riders pulled up hard, dust swirling around their horses' legs. One of them called out, his voice sharp and unforgiving. "You thought you could vanish, didn't you? Thought a place like this could hide you?" The drifter didn't answer. His silence spoke louder than any words. The widow could feel her heart hammering, each beat aching against her ribs. She wanted to cry out, to beg him to run, but her voice would not rise above a whisper. The leader of the men dismounted, his boots hitting the dirt with a thud. He stepped closer, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. "You know why we're here? You can't outrun what you did." The widow's breath caught. The truth she had feared was now spilling into the open, yet still the drifter's eyes stayed steady, as though he had already made peace with what was to come. Finally he spoke, his voice rough but steady. "Not the man I was back then." The words fell heavy in the air. The widow's heart twisted at them, for she knew they carried more than just a defense. They carried a confession. Whatever past haunted him, it was real, and it had followed him straight into her world. The men laughed, a sound without mercy. "A man doesn't change," the leader sneered. "Debt stays. Blood stays. You don't get to walk away." A moment the widow thought violence would erupt right there. But the drifter lifted his hands slightly, not in surrender, but in restraint. His eyes flicked once toward the town, toward her, as though reminding them all that this wasn't just about him. It was about everyone caught in the crossfire. The sheriff stepped forward then, his old badge catching a faint gleam of dying light. His voice was weary but firm. "This is my town. Whatever quarrel you've brought, it doesn't belong here." The riders turned on him, but before they could answer, the drifter spoke again. "They're right," he said quietly. "I have to trail behind me. I made choices that can't be undone, but I won't let you drag these people into it. It ends with me." The widow felt her knees weaken. His words were not just for the riders, they were for her too. The weight of his past had always stood between them, and now it had finally spoken. She wanted to run to him, to plead with him not to give himself up. But she knew this was the reckoning he had been walking toward since the day he first stepped into town. The standoff stretched in silence, broken only by the restless snort of horses and the distant cry of a crow. Then, like the crack of lightning, the moment snapped. The leader's hand twitched toward his gun, and in an instant, steel glinted in the dying sun. The drifter moved, faster, his hands steady, his shot ringing out across the plains. Dust flew, Horses reared, shouts echoed. When the smoke cleared, 2 of the men were already retreating, their fury drowned in fear. The leader lay in the dirt, his gun dropped beside him, strength gone with the echo of the shot. The widow covered her mouth, tears burning her eyes. The town stayed hidden, silent as a graveyard, though she knew every soul had heard the truth. Unfold. The drifter stood over the fallen man, his chest rising and falling, his eyes shadowed with both relief and sorrow. He had not wanted this. She could see it. He had wanted peace. But peace had never wanted him. The sheriff stepped forward, his gaze heavy. "It's done," he said. "But you can't stay." The words were soft, yet final. The drifter nodded once. He had known it even before the shots rang out. His past might have bled into the dirt of this town, but his future could not take root here. The widow's heart shattered at the truth of it. As the men rode off with the body of their fallen leader, as the dust settled back onto the weary street, she felt the weight of everything she had lost and everything she had found. The drifter walked toward her, his face etched with the burden of what had passed. For a moment, they stood close, silence thick between them. "I never meant to bring this on you," he said, his voice low, his eyes holding hers with a kind of desperate tenderness. She shook her head, tears streaking her cheeks. "Made me remember I'm alive," she whispered, "even if it cost me everything." His hand lifted slightly, as though to touch her, but then dropped back to his side. He could not give her promises. He could not give her peace. All he could give was truth. The next morning, he was gone. No farewell, no trace, only the emptiness of the road stretching westward. The town breathed easier, though the whispers lingered, heavy with the memory of what had come. The widow sat at her table, staring at the empty chair across from her. For the first time since her husband's passing, it no longer felt like a monument to grief. It felt like a reminder of choice. She returned off into the churchyard, to the grave where her prayers had faltered. She still knelt, still whispered words into the silence, but her prayers had changed. They were no longer pleas for strength to bury her heart. They were prayers for courage to live with it. The town would go on, as towns always did, but she had been changed, her soul marked forever by the fire of what had passed through her life. The drifter became a ghost in memory, a man both cursed and redeemed, carrying his burden down roads unknown. Yet for her, he remained something more. He had forced her to face her longing, to reckon with the truth her late husband's sermons had. Never named that life was not only duty and sorrow, but desire and choice. That even in grief, the heart could still burn. And so the widow lived on. Her days filled with the rhythm of the town, her nights touched by silence. But within her, the fire never went out. It reminded her of him, of the kiss that had awakened. Her, of the storm that had passed through and left her standing in its aftermath, stronger than she had ever known herself to be. She would carry it always, not as sin, not as shame, but as proof that she was still alive. In the end, the story of the widow and the drifter was not one of promises kept or lives entwined. It was a story of awakening, of facing the truth that love and loss could exist together, that desire could bloom even in the shadow of sorrow, and that the heart, no matter how bound by the past, could still find its way to freedom. And though the town would whisper for years, though the dust of that summer would never fully settle, the widow knew her own truth. She had loved, she had feared, and she had lived. And in that she found her peace.